What is up, family? I hope you are having a wonderful day today. So, this is going to be part one to a series on a topic that we'll call no self. Essentially, what I mean by no self is it's this belief that you and I don't actually exist. And this is something that I see in spiritual and non duality circles all the time. Basically, this idea that there is no individual eternal soul. Now, there's a bunch of different variations of this belief, but the most common variation seems to be that there is this concept that all that exists is this one being, God, and that all of these human lives are basically variations of God. They're variations of God experiencing himself, playing hide and go seek with himself. But basically, this renders us not individuals, right? It basically leads to the conclusion that there is no eternal individual self. No self, right? So in this first part of the series, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the problems in contradictions with this commonly held spiritual idea. And let's start with reincarnation. Now, reincarnation, of course, is this idea that there is transmigration of an individual soul from body to body with hopes of eventually breaking free from materiality altogether. So, if we hold the view that there is no self, and we understand that a lot of people that hold this view of no self believe in reincarnation, then this leads to a few questions. First off, what exactly is it that is reincarnating then? What exactly is it that is accruing karma? And lastly, what is the point of it, right? So again, reincarnation is transmigration of an individual soul, but we're saying there is no individual soul. So what is it that's reincarnating? And what is the purpose of it then? You know, even if we say, like we were saying before, that it's this belief that we're all variations of God, why is God accruing karma on an individual level and going through these different transmigrations, right? And another issue here is no self ultimately leads to this form of spiritual hedonism. It leads to relativism, because think about it. If there is no self, there's no actual individual soul, then it renders the entire spiritual path meaningless, because there's no point to anything. What is the point of purifying yourself? What is the point of aspiring to break free of this realm? What is the point of aspiring towards spiritual growth? There is no you. There's no you to aspire to any of these things. So it leads to this kind of form of spiritual hedonism and relativism, where first off, it doesn't really matter what you do here, because there's really no point to it, because there is no you. But it also leads to kind of like this relativism where it doesn't matter what path you follow. Like, for example, what does it matter if you're a Luciferian versus a yogi? What does it matter if you're an atheist versus an Orthodox Christian? What does it matter if you are like a very saintly person versus a person with a demonic nature? None of these things ultimately matter, because there is no you. And without there being a you, without there being an individual, there's nothing to actually aspire to. There's no point to the spiritual path. So this leads to relativism, it leads to hedonism, and it leads to spiritual bypassing, because without there being a point to anything, right, people just say I'm spiritual and then live however they want, and it just leads to all of these sorts of things. Here's another issue with no self. So going back to what we were saying in the beginning, how there's this common variation of no self, where it basically is this idea that we're all God. So if we're all God, why is it that your neighbor down the street doesn't know he's God? So let's say that you have a neighbor down your street, and we'll call him Joe Schmo. And I talk to Joe, and Joe shows me that he doesn't know he's God. Well, this means that Joe must be an illusion. And if Joe is an illusion and Joe is God, this means that illusion is more powerful than God. And if illusion is more powerful than God, this means that God is not all powerful. You see, this leads to a very major problem with this stuff, where it really is, it's a big issue. So another issue, and this tends to manifest more with like Buddhism, because Buddhism also, a lot of the modern forms of Buddhism kind of lead to this idea of no self, but it often manifests a little differently in Buddhism, and sometimes it's almost more atheistic, right? But there will be this idea that, I mean, this is true even not in Buddhism too, but there's this idea that basically we're trying to be liberated from suffering, right? We're trying to escape suffering. Well, if we are suffering, there must be a self that's suffering, right? If we're saying that we're trying to seek liberation from suffering, well, then there is a self that's suffering. Someone, it must be suffering, you see. But we're saying there is no you. There's no me and you. So who is suffering then, you see? It's another major issue and contradiction. So yeah, these are some of the major problems and issues. And I actually wanted to read you guys a few things that I recently saw on social media here, to show you just some more examples of what I'm talking about, of how common this view is. So here's one I just saw on Twitter. This is actually a really popular Twitter account that just shared this. And this is the post. And the post is actually, this quote is actually attributed to Eckhart Tolle. Now, I don't know if Eckhart Tolle actually said this, but here's the quote. It says, "You are not in the universe. You are the universe, an intrinsic part of it. Ultimately, you are not a person, but a focal point where the universe is becoming conscious of itself." What an amazing miracle. So as you can see in this quote attributed to Eckhart Tolle, it's this idea of no self. It says you are not a person. It denies personhood, right? And then it goes on to say you are the universe, right? And really, ultimately, what this is a materialistic viewpoint, because the universe is actually material, right? It's made of matter. Even though matter is one of God's energies, this is still more of a materialistic view. And, you know, he goes on to deny personhood, to deny individuality. This is like this no self idea. And here's another one I saw. Okay, so this was another popular Twitter account, and this is more of an illustration, sort of a meme. And it's like this Buddhist guy, and then there's this quote like coming off him. It's an illustration, and it says, "We are all the same person experiencing life in a bunch of different bodies." So again, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier in this talk, right? This idea that there's no individual self. And once you start paying attention to this, you'll start seeing this everywhere. You know, this is just such a commonly held idea in modern times when it comes to spiritual circles. And I've noticed that a lot of people that hold this view, they tend to see the ego itself as the personality. And, we're going to talk more about the ego in the last part of this series. But very briefly here, I just want to say that this is a misunderstanding, okay? Because when you understand that you're actually an individual, eternal soul, you understand that as an eternal soul, you are a personality, right? The ego, the false ego, is actually false persona. It's misidentification with anything other than the true self, which is a personality. So, I just wanted to add that in there because I've noticed that usually that tends to go hand in hand with this idea of no self. These things kind of go together. And like I said, we're actually going to talk about ego in the last part of this series. But I thought that was important there. But anyways, I think that's good for the first talk. And in the next talk, what we're going to do, we're going to go a little bit deeper into non-duality. And we're going to talk about kind of this like common way of seeing non-duality that arises from the belief in no self versus a more nuanced understanding of non-duality. So that will be in part 2. And I hope you guys enjoyed this talk. My name is Keith. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful, incredible, spectacular, amazing, phenomenal, terrific, and above average day. I'm out. Peace.